This video is all about how to analyse a source, and I'm just going to do it with one source, but I'll tell you at the end how you can apply this to source questions where they give you two sources and you have to say which one is the best. So this video is just focusing on the skill of analysis. Okay, so what I've got is I've got a sheet here that allows me to pick apart the source on this side and then to write up my analysis on this side. Okay, so let's zoom in a little bit on picking apart the source. So the first thing you do when you get given a source is you have to find its strengths and its weaknesses. And that just depends on what the question is asking you to find. So this source is asking, to what extent does it accurately reflect how the poor were dealt with during the Elizabethan era? So I've highlighted that because it's the focus of the question. So when I look at the source, I am looking for evidence that the poor are being dealt with. So the first thing we think about in the 5 W's is, what information does it give me? The magic number is 2. So you were looking for two bits of information about how the poor were dealt with. So that's what this top box up here is about. So I have picked out that it tells us that beggars were punished, and I can see that in the source where one of them is being whipped or that they're being chained up. I've then also gathered, because I need 2 to be my magic number, looking at the attribution of the source, it says it's a drawing of men who had robbed a house of a dying man. So I've said, based on that, if they've robbed the house of a dying man, that they're obviously quite desperate. So people were desperate, or poverty was on the rise, you could say. Okay, so that's what from the 5 W's. We then think about what information is missing, because you look for the 5 W's when you're picking apart the source, but when you start to write out your analysis, you could use the COOP structure: content, which is the what question, and then own knowledge, which isn't any of the 5 W questions, but it's something that you can do to add extra facts to try and get that AO1 assessment objective, which is in every exam question, which is how many facts can you recall. So I always do a box that says, is this true? And I say yes and no. Yes means you can back up what's in the source using your own knowledge, and no means that you can say if there's anything that's missing, which again shows off your own knowledge, but also analyses the source, because we can use it later as a weakness. So is it true that beggars were punished? Yes, it was true that beggars were arrested or fined or whipped. This is true. However, is this the only way that the poor were being dealt with? Well, no, because we have the poor law being introduced in, well, let's say the last one in 1601. There were poor rates being paid, which were people were giving money to help deal with the poor, and poor houses were being set up, and apprenticeships and jobs being given to the poor. So again, I'm showing off my own knowledge there, but I'm also saying that there is key information missing from this source. So just by looking at content, we have got a strength in terms of what it does show us, and we've got a weakness in terms of what's missing from the source. Okay, let's focus on the other 5 W's then. Who, when, why, and where sometimes, but I tend to leave where out unless it's really obvious. So that's what these 3 boxes are about. Who made the source? Well, I've said it's unknown. If it's unknown, there's no point in really talking about it. However, if you're aiming for a high target grade, I have said you need to read between the lines a little bit, which means you need to look for clues that can answer some of the 5 W's for you. So it doesn't actually say who wrote the source, but if we're looking at the source, it's making beggars or poor people look really bad. So we could say the author is somebody who is not sympathetic to the poor. And that means we can answer the next question, is this a good or a bad thing? Well, it's bad because they're biased against, which means they're only going to give negative information, and it won't necessarily be true because it won't be the full picture. Next question is easier. When was it made? Because it says 1565. Is this good or bad? It's good because it's primary. which means in terms of how the poor were being dealt with during the Elizabethan era, it's going to give us an accurate idea. I always use the word accurate with primary because if you're in the moment, if you're there, if you've experienced it, you're more likely to remember it with accuracy or portray it with accuracy, whereas if you reflect on something later on, you might reflect on it in a more positive way, or you might have gotten angry about it, or you might just not be able to remember things as well as you did 5 minutes or something after the event happened. Okay, and then why was the source made? I tend to put why into 3 categories. Is it being made to educate us, which is usually what historians or textbooks are doing? Is it being made to entertain us, because we get a lot of cartoons and things like that as sources? Or is it being made to persuade us? So if you had a speech, propaganda speech or poster or something like that, it's tending to persuade somebody to agree with them. So I've said this one is kind of trying to educate us about the law, or educate us about how the poor are being dealt with, because it's showing us how they're being dealt with. And then I've also said, because we thought it's not very sympathetic towards the poor, that maybe the purpose is to persuade us that the poor are dangerous and should therefore be dealt with harshly. So if this is good or bad, I would say this is probably the bias is winning out. So I would say bad due to bias. Okay, so this is what you would do if you were planning your source analysis and you were picking it apart. Now, as you practice doing this, you would be trying to do this without all these boxes and things like that. So you would be highlighting your 2 things, you'd be adding some notes saying not true or this is missing, you'd be highlighting the date, just doing a little smiley face to say this is a good thing, you might be highlighting the purpose and doing a little frowny face and saying this is a bad thing. That could be done in 2 or 3 minutes as you're reading through the source, and then you can focus on actually writing it up. So that's what we do. We pick apart the source using the 5 W's, and I use those to figure out are there strengths and are there weaknesses. That leads me to writing it up then. Like I said, you can use the COOP method. Content, origin, own knowledge, origin and purpose. I'm going to try something a bit simpler today, which some of my students have been using. Instead of COOP, we're just going to do strength of the source and then weakness of the source. And those could be 2 separate paragraphs if you wanted them to be, or you can merge them into 1 paragraph. But within that, you are still talking about content, origin and purpose. You're just not making it as obvious. So always start with content, whether you're doing a COOP paragraph or whether you're just saying these are the strengths, these are the weaknesses. Start with content. So let's start with strength in terms of content. What did it have going for us? Well, in terms of how the poor were dealt with, it gives examples of how the poor were dealt with. And then you would have to quote the source. We can't quote a drawing in this case, so we would say it shows beggars being whipped and chained. Then you always have to say this shows, every time you give a quote or evidence, this shows us that beggars were punished. Okay, it also says our second evidence was they robbed the house of a dying man, which I said showed us that the poor were desperate. Okay, then our other strength was the date, wasn't it? We said it was a primary source. Now, if you were doing this as a COOP paragraph, origin is where does the source come from? So that can be who was the author, where was it made, and when. So we're still doing origin, and sometimes the purpose will be the strength. So you're still using those things. It's just if you'd rather do it as a paragraph for strengths and a paragraph for weaknesses, it's fine, whatever makes more sense to you. So we said another strength is the source was created in 1565 during the Elizabethan era, so we'll give an accurate idea of how they are dealing with the poor. Okay, and then our weaknesses. Again, we're dealing with content first. So we said the weakness was there was some information missing. So however is a good way of starting a weakness one, isn't it? However, the source does not give us all the ways the poor were dealt with, such as poor law, such as poor rates and houses, poor houses, and creating jobs, which came under the poor laws. Okay, so we've got a weakness. Origin and purpose. Well, we said origin in terms of author wasn't clear and probably biased, and then we said the purpose is biased. So we could say the author is unknown, but due to the negative portrayal of the poor, it is likely the author is not sympathetic. And let's work in the purpose, not sympathetic, as the purpose of the source is to make the poor look dangerous. This leads me to question the accuracy, as it is biased against the poor. Well, there you go. Okay, so in this now we have got the strengths, content, we've got the strengths in terms of when it was made, we've got weakness, content, we've added some of our own knowledge to further show that, and therefore we've hit some of AO1, and then we've thought about origin and purpose being a weakness too. So we have been balanced, we've given strengths and weaknesses, we've done the 5 W's because we've talked about when it was made, what information it gave, why it was created. So if you wanted to do it as a quick paragraph, that's absolutely fine. You would just talk about the content, what it had, own knowledge, what it was missing, origin and purpose, and you would be talking about strengths and weaknesses constantly throughout that. Or you can just do it as, here are the strengths, here are the weaknesses. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. You could now apply this to any source question that you wanted. If this was just analysing one source, you would do it like this. If it was, and often in medicine and in Germany, you get 2 sources and you have to compare, you would do the same thing. You would analyse the first source in this way, you would analyse the second source in this way, and then you would write a conclusion paragraph saying, overall, which one is the best, and you would give 2 reasons why, because 2 is the magic number. Sometimes if you have one source, it might be nice to get into the habit of doing a conclusion as well. It's sort of just a general summary of how accurate is this source. So you might say something for this one like, it's accurate in terms of showing punishments, but it's not accurate in terms of showing us ways they were helping the poor. And that could be because the author is probably biased against the poor. And that would be a nice summary then, and then you're sort of telling the examiner, I know what I'm talking about, and covering your back. Okay, so you could choose any question from any paper and apply this same method, so get practicing.